This is Matthew with Another World Terraria, where I teach and inspire you on the topics of rare plants and artistic nature displays. Welcome to part 3 of how I made the Buce Ravine Terrarium. In the previous video, I finished the hardscape. Now it's time to plant the terrarium. The first step is to add sterilized sphagnum moss into all the crevices to provide a moist substrate for the moss and ferns. I sterilized the sphagnum to prevent unwanted mosses from growing out of it. Here I've stuffed sphagnum into the area below the tree stump. Using tweezers is very helpful to work in tight areas and small cracks. Here I've added some sphagnum between the roots. Note the sand which was added over the epoxy while the roots were being attached to the rock, as explained in a previous video in the series, to conceal the epoxy. Eventually this will probably be covered by moss and plants, but I still like to conceal unnatural elements because I don't always know what will be visible later in the build. Here's some sphagnum around the side of the tree stump, and some packed under the overhanging stump and around the protruding roots. Now we're ready to add the plants. I went through all of my Buceplant bins and pulled out divisions of some of my favorite miniature species. To learn every detail of exactly how I grow my Buceplant, check out my tutorial series, How to Grow Immersed Buceplant Like a Boss. Here's a close-up of one of my favorite species of Busi. This one has leaves to about 1 centimeter long with a nice raised midrib, and it grows in tight and compact clumps. I can't provide names for most of my Busi because I don't have them identified. There are so many species of Busi and similar plants, and in general they just go by useless trade names in the hobby. Here's another favorite mini with very narrow leaves with undulated edges. And here's the planted terrarium. I don't have any photos of the planting process, but I can share some tips and details with you now, and you can also watch my Busi tutorial series mentioned earlier for more info on planting them. In this terrarium, I planted the Busi by inserting their roots into the bonsai block substrate while keeping the rhizomes above it. Unlike my grow bins, I did not use fluval-stratum. The ones in the crevices higher up the rock were inserted into the holes, and then I put some bonsai block and small dragonstone chips around the roots. Here's a front view full tank shot with the plants. Note that most of the Busi are at the bottom because they like less light and more water, moisture, and humidity. I did put a few in the rock crevices higher up to add interest and tie the design together, but I'll need to mist those a lot more and ensure that the crevices don't dry out. Here's a close-up shot of the bottom of the tank. The tiny bright green plants in between the clumps of Busi are what is commonly known as Busi moss. Despite the name, it's actually a species of liverwort, not a true moss. The same is true of a number of other plants in the aquarium trade, such as coral moss, which is a species of Ricardia, and Cameroon moss, which is most likely from the Plagiochylaceae family of liverworts. Normally I refer to plants by the Latin names, but since I don't yet know what genus the Busi moss belongs to, I have to refer to it as Busi moss. Anyway, I have some cultures of it growing in a few containers, so I was able to pull a few pieces out and use it in this terrarium. The species is extremely slow growing, unfortunately. As shown in my Busi tutorial series, I added some Osmocote Plus slow-release fertilizer into the substrate. This is especially important for this terrarium because the bonsai block substrate doesn't have enough nutrients in it to sustain healthy long-term growth. I also want to point out again the miscellaneous dragonstone fragments that I added randomly throughout the bottom area. As noted earlier in this series, it breaks up the monotony of the consistently sized particles of bonsai block, which ties together the design and makes it look more natural. Next, I planted some moss and ferns in the upper area around the tree stump and roots. The plant with the round leaves is a fern called Lemophyllum microphyllum, which is a small epiphytic species with creeping rhizomes. The fern was laid over the sphagnum and tucked into the crevices around the rocks and roots, and then a tiny bit of sphagnum was packed around the rhizome and roots so that it stays snugly in place and there's enough moisture. This grass-like moss is called Octoblepharum. It prefers good drainage and even moisture and doesn't like to be too wet. It's an excellent moss which grows best as an epiphyte on sphagnum and moist wood and prefers reasonably bright light. The moss was inserted using tweezers so I could tuck it into the cracks and between plants. Here's a full tank shot of the planted terrarium just after completing it. After planting, I added some springtails and a few isopods in to create a healthier environment and help control mold and decomposing matter. I have some videos on my channel about springtails and isopods, so feel free to check those out if you'd like to learn more. The wood and roots will grow mold on them because of the moisture and humidity. Mold's totally natural and will occur when organics are decomposing. The type of mold that has shown up on the roots and tree stump is not harmful and will generally go away in a month or two. This terrarium will need some time to grow in, but eventually the moss will spread onto the roots, rocks, and stump, creating a more natural appearance. Now I'll share some info about the care and maintenance. I mist the terrarium with distilled water every couple days, ensuring that I get some water in the crevices of the rock where the Busi are. For the ferns and moss near the top, I may occasionally spray them with a quarter strength liquid fertilizer such as Sea Grow. The lid vents are kept mostly closed on the Mossarium CL-02 to ensure adequate humidity for these tropical and moisture-loving plants. I might occasionally open the vents for a few minutes to circulate some fresh air. I keep all my terrarium and plant growing lights on digital timers with 13-hour photo periods. I like timers like this one, which allow up to 8 on-off programs per 24 hours and allow each day to have a different program. I use the same schedule all 7 days of the week, but the multiple on-offs can be used for things like fan air circulation. If you enjoyed this series of videos, check out my other behind-the-scenes terrarium builds playlist, as well as a variety of other tutorials and plant videos.